Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello and welcome to this episode of LawPod. I'm Dr. Bróna McNeill and I'm a lecturer here in the School of Law at Queen's. And what we're going to talk about today is Lough Neagh. Obviously, Lough Neagh has been in the news and we've seen a lot of media coverage about the crisis that's unfolding there at the minute. What we want to focus on today are the issues around the ownership of the lough and how that has impacted on some of the problems that we're seeing there at the moment. So, as well as being a lecturer in the School of Law, I'm also involved in an organisation called the Environmental Justice Network Ireland, or EJNI. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Ciara Brennan, who is the director of EJNI. And we jointly produced a briefing paper a couple of weeks ago looking specifically at this issue of the ownership of Lough Neagh and how we might go about securing a more sustainable future. So I think maybe if we start by talking a little bit about EJNI, about the Environmental Justice Network Ireland, and really, I suppose, Ciara, it might be useful to kind of explain why EJNI has been interested in the crisis that's unfolded at Lough Neagh and some of the issues that are coming up there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bróna. So my name is Ciara Brennan, as Bróna has said, and I'm formerly an academic and I am still a visiting research fellow at the University of Newcastle Law School. And in 2019, along with some colleagues from across multiple organisations in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, we set up the Environmental Justice Network Ireland. And really the reason why we set it up was because everyone was becoming so frustrated with the lack of any meaningful action in the arena of environmental governance reform in the North and in the context of weak cooperation across the border. So we set up EJNI really to promote collaboration between lawyers, academics, NGOs, civil society, to try to work together to push for reform across a number of really critical areas. So obviously, Lough Neagh really encapsulates the reasons why EJNI was formed, because it's an incredibly complex problem which is going to involve solutions coming from all of those stakeholder groups that we've just mentioned. But it's also going to require quite a lot of political investment to try to fix and reverse the problems that have gone on. So that's why EJNI is really interested in Lough Neagh. And I think the other reason is that it's really an all-island problem. And I think this is something that has possibly been underplayed in the media and the press at the minute, that part of Lough Neagh's catchment is across the border. I think obviously, pollution doesn't respect the border. We also know from media reports and from pollution reports down south that the blue-green algae problem, which is one of the issues in Lough Neagh, is an issue in many other rivers and lakes, down south. And I think as well that what we're going to need to do is work together with stakeholders to consider, why this is an issue. But really fundamentally, I think, and I suppose this leads on to Bróna's research expertise, that we have broader problem with environmental governance in the North, which is Lough Neagh is just one example. It's a very obvious example and it's one that seems to have captured the public's imagination. But we've had systemic failure across really almost all areas of environmental regulation stretching back at least 30 years. We've seen that. There's been other examples. We've seen serious problems with planning. We've seen the dump at Maboy is one of the largest in Europe. Yeah. And the fact that these problems have happened here indicates a broader problem, Bróna. So I think that's one layer of issues that have contributed to the Lough Neagh problem. But really, a lot of those issues have been dictated or informed by the question of ownership. This is what I'm interested in hearing about, is why is ownership of the lough so important at this stage?
Well, just like you said, Ciara, we obviously have really like a catastrophic failure of effective environmental regulation. across the jurisdiction. And that means that in the absence of that kind of effective layer of regulation, the ownership of the land, of natural features like Lough Neagh, is really, really critical, because owners essentially have the decision-making power over things. Like, that's what ownership is. Property is having the agenda-setting power over our things. And like, sometimes that's quite uncontroversial. So like, it's relatively uncontroversial that I have the decision-making power over my laptop, for example. But whenever we're talking about something like Lough Neagh, which is, I mean, we've heard in the media reports, I heard one statistic that it's bigger in surface area, it's bigger than Malta. So like, we have to kind of ask ourselves whether it's really appropriate, whether private ownership and the fact that an individual is effectively one individual who lives in East Dorset makes all of the decisions about this feature in the smack bang in the middle of Northern Ireland. So I think really that's why, at its heart, that's really what this is about, is that appropriate? Is it okay that, that one person is making all of the decisions about the ownership of the loch? And I think that kind of leads on to maybe talking a bit more specifically about some of the specific problems with the current ownership status. So, the current owner, who, I mean, we've probably heard in the media, that is the 12th Earl of Shaftesbury, who actually inherited Lough Neagh in 2005. The current owner is entitled to any benefits that can be derived from the loch, and that includes benefits relating to mineral rights like sand dredging, and also any income generated from like lease and licensing.
That sand dredging and stuff like that, we know that extraction has happened quite extensively. I mean, there was press coverage in a number of outlets this weekend about numerous GAA stadiums being built with concrete, with sand from Lough Neagh. So we know that's, and I think like a couple of football stadiums in England have been built with that. So do you think, obviously that extraction, the current owner has taken advantage of those rights so far?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is the issue around private ownership. So, decisions that are made in relation to what happens in and on the loch, the way in which it's used and managed, those decisions are conditioned and informed, I suppose, by the idea and the sense that the loch is a business asset, right? So it's it's something that is there, it's making money for the current owner.
Yeah.
And that's something that, that's shaping the kinds of decisions that are made. So the owner is entitled to any benefits that come from the loch, but isn't dealing with any of the harmful.
And who is?
So, I mean, it's the local communities and, the environment
itself,
of course. The loch is obviously a delicately balanced ecological system in itself. And having the sand dredging, it's literally, I mean, I don't know technically how sand dredging happens, but my understanding is that it's boats that go out onto the loch. They put down tubes to the bed of the loch and literally just take the sand away. And you can't help but visualize how damaging that must be. It's literally destroying when you've got the ecosystem.
That compared with, we also know from I think a lot of the media reports have focused on like what are the actual physical causes of this. So we know sand extraction is one. We know that invasive species is another one. But I think that the other two major ones, which I think need to be flagged, is the sort of the nutrient overload from sewage discharges, but also, and I think fundamentally this is one of the biggest ones, is obviously the agricultural runoff and the pollution from agriculture. And I think that's been one of the increasing, the focus points of the analysis is that, the Going for Growth strategy from 2013. I mean, it was in the Irish Times today from Newton Emerson, like that you cannot have an intensification of agriculture without having proper regulatory systems in place to deal with it. So you've got this problem with regulation, you've got the problem with the owner controlling the extractive industries there or benefiting from it.
The way the decisions are being made and the way the decisions are being fueled and informed. And all of that has kind of coalesced into the crisis that we're seeing at the minute. And I think there's been a lot of chat in the media coverage about this idea of public ownership and whether that could help alleviate some of the problems. And I think that actually, in a lot of ways, it's a little bit problematic because I've read a lot of stuff that sort of talks about public ownership as if it's like a magic bullet, right? As if that we're going to switch from private ownership to public ownership, and that's going to solve all of the problems. And I think that it's important to recognize that actually it's much more nuanced than that. It's not as straightforward as saying, right, we'll just, public ownership.
Yeah.
We'll get the state to buy the loch from the 12th Earl of Shaftesbury, and then everything is going to be fine.
Yeah.
Of course, it's a very, very complex problem. And the thing is that public ownership isn't necessarily going to lead to better environmental outcomes, right? So if the public ownership essentially will involve a sort of a government body, so, probably DAERA, would kind of own and manage the loch on behalf of the public, but they would also be under they would have specific obligations and requirements to manage it in the public interest. And sometimes that can be interpreted as, making the most money as possible.
Yeah.
So there's the potential for some quite problematic governance arrangements and quite problematic decision making that could flow from public ownership as well.
I mean, that's not to say that, there's no opportunity for economic benefit to arise from public ownership of the loch. I mean, but I suppose, the thing that I'm interested in is what would the potential benefits of public ownership be? Because we know it's not necessarily going to deliver better environmental outcomes. It's not necessarily going to mean a shift in focus from economic benefits, but what are the positive reasons behind why is there a push, do you think, for public ownership? Is it just because it has failed so abysmally up to now in private ownership, or is there more fundamental reasons?
Well, I guess the attraction of talking about public ownership is that it's shifting away from that kind of centralized decision making. So that agenda setting power, a private owner is, it's essentially it's one guy.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of distributing the decision making over a larger number of people, over a larger number of stakeholders, and kind of, like you say, it's broadening out the reasons behind decision making. So there will be some economic considerations, but then, there would also be kind of environmental and social justice dimensions to the kind of decision making as well, but only if the governance arrangements are carefully designed with the environment and local communities in mind.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I think it's that idea of public ownership is shifting away from it being kind of a centralized decision making. So
also that would allow like public participation, for example, to take place in consulting around what that ownership or how the loch is used and how we interact with the loch. And I think that's something critical that's missing at the minute, is that when it's maybe in private ownership, that public participation or consultative element isn't as prominent as it should be, So I think that to me, that would be a very strong argument for it, because obviously it borders 5 of the 6 counties in the north, and there's many, many, many other stakeholders beyond the people who are going to be made rich by the sand extraction,
Yeah, so. And I think this is one of the things that people have talked about is this idea of the commons, or sort of community ownership, which is one option. So it's not exactly the same as public ownership. And I think that we need to be clear about that. So when we talk about all of these kind of different governance options or different kind of ownership structures that might produce better environmental outcomes, they begin with state acquisition, or the public, the loch being acquired on behalf of the public. That would be the beginning.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily lead to sort of public management. So this idea of community ownership would be a sort of alternative model of ownership. And that would obviously mean that the communities themselves, there would be a sort of community body established that would be representative of a number of different stakeholders, and they would own and manage the loch on behalf of the local community. So you can see how that's a much more participatory kind of model of ownership and management, which feeds in exactly to the kind of stuff you're saying.
Maybe it's more accurate to say that rather than pushing for public ownership, it's a push away from private ownership. And then to explore the options within that would deliver the most participatory functions that would allow, a voice for the environment. And maybe this is where this idea about rights of nature comes in, because we've done some, EJ and I's done some work on that, and Bróna and your colleague at Queen's, Dr. Peter Doran's working at the minute on constitutional amendment to the Irish constitution, to integrate a rights of nature, sort of prerogative at constitutional level. So where do you think the rights of nature stuff comes into this debate about Lough Neagh and ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of important points to make about the rights of nature. I mean, from my perspective, it's something that has really captured like public attention. You know, I think that people like the idea of rights of nature. And as you say, it was discussed as part of the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Laws last year. And, it was one of the recommendations that came out in that report that people kind of wanted to see some kind of constitutional amendment, some kind of recognition that nature also has the right to exist, the right to flourish and those kinds of things. So I think the rights of nature conversation more broadly it's quite a broad ranging kind of philosophical kind of approach. But I think the important thing to say within it is that there's no one correct way of like doing or achieving
because it's been done in different ways in countries all over the world.
Sometimes it's constitutional amendment. There are a range of different ways of doing it. I think that there is scope to use a rights of nature approach to produce better environmental outcomes and secure a more sustainable future for Lough Neagh. But we need to choose the right kind of approach. And it's not going to look the same in different places. I think for somewhere like Lough Neagh, a really useful model that could be used is the one that was used in Te Urewera in New Zealand, which is a former national park. And back in 2014, the New Zealand government passed a piece of legislation that basically granted the fee simple ownership, so that literally the land ownership, the ownership of the park itself in the park. So the park essentially, it's a piece of land that owns itself. And that was, was established in a piece of legislation. So it's a very, very kind of detailed sort of piece of legislation. It's very, very long. But at the beginning, it essentially establishes two fundamental things. The first one is that the park has legal personhood. So it's capable of having rights. That's something that's kind of intrinsic to the rights of nature movement. And also that the land is inalienable, so it can never be transferred again. So it can never be sold. So that's the thing. So it takes away that possibility completely. So I suppose, again, it's a different place. It's a different context. But that kind of model could be something that works at Lough Neagh. So I know that sometimes when you hear about the rights of nature, it's kind of hard to visualize or conceptualize exactly what that's going to look like.
Well, we've had conversations about how, there's the philosophical or the kind of, the sentiment behind it. I think that's not difficult to get people behind. I mean, we saw that in the Citizens' Assembly. But the big questions, I suppose, come in, how do you operationalize that?
I think that's it.
And how do you operationalize that in the context, especially in the north, where there's been complete collapse of many ecosystems, but also systemic failure across all regulation? I mean, is it that, does that make it harder, or does that make the prerogative to try something else like rights of nature really more important because everything else so far has failed? And I think this is the conversation that the rights of nature discussion is beginning to push into the public domain. And I think Lough Neagh maybe is a totemic example. It's the most obvious one, especially now given the ecological collapse. Maybe this is exactly where the rights of nature movement becomes operationalized in Ireland.
I agree. I think as well, rights of nature is, like you say, it's is at the time, have we gotten to the point now? If not now, then when we're seeing what's happening at Lough Neagh,
there's not going to be much left to protect if we don't do it now.
I know exactly. And I think it's, the rights of nature movement, it is novel. And it challenges ideas about existing kind of environmental regulation, but it challenges ideas about property as well. And going back to that question of ownership, it challenges the idea that property and ownership is all about entitlement, and it kind of pushes it towards being something that's actually about responsibility. Like, should we change the kinds of ideas and beliefs that we have about what it means to own something?
Well, I suppose it's like rebalancing the duties and obligations with the rights of property owners as well. It's about reimagining that in the context of our relationship with nature, So, but what does that look like? So you've sort of said that there's an example from New Zealand that might work here. But I mean, my concern would be that it would be easy to think about a change to ownership as being the only thing, as you say, a magic bullet that is going to fix the problems at Lough Neagh. But really, it's going to have to be part of a much
Yeah.
bigger series of events or series of changes that needs to happen. And, one of those is a complete reform of the environmental governance system in the north. Like that, if without that, the pollution is going to keep happening. And no matter who owns the lough, that is going to keep, that's going to keep being a problem. So I think that's something that we, need the British and Irish governments need to both look at as a matter of urgency, but in tandem. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a push for the change in ownership or, and a look at whether this rights of nature approach might actually be the most effective way of ensuring that we don't continue to see further decline.
Yeah. And challenging the status quo. Like, I think that's ultimately that's what's all about.
Yeah.
And I think, you're right. There's urgent action needs to happen, like literally immediately.
Yeah.
We need to place greater restrictions perhaps on agricultural activity in around the lough, because we know, like, this is the point is we know what is causing the problems, like we know what the issues are, but of course it's really difficult to make any of these kinds of decisions or take any of this action in the absence of devolved administration.
Well, and I think the thing is, I mean, like you said, like there's urgent action is needed. I mean, if we saw the same urgency from the British and Irish governments and the politicians who are supposed to be sitting at Stormont, to getting back into government, I think that urgency might be able to be acted upon. But we're not seeing that. And I think, so what needs to happen now is we need to look at what are the alternative mechanisms of governance that can function in the absence of Stormont here. And I think that the Irish government needs to appreciate that this is an all-island problem. As I said at the start, the catchment area of Lough Neagh crosses the border.
Yeah.
Like
and of course, the Water Framework Directive, still, the EU's Water Framework Directive still applies in Northern Ireland.
It still applies.
Yeah.
And also, and in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, I mean, environment is part of Strand 2, one of the areas of cooperation. We just haven't seen the structures established under the Good Friday Agreement being used to their maximum potential to ensure that cooperation and collaboration occurred. So I think, we published a report on linking the Irish environment, before the summer. And I think we cover quite a lot of those issues and how those structures, such as the British Irish, council, like the North-South Ministerial Council, all of those structures established under the Good Friday Agreement, there's more potential that can be used. And the question now is, in the absence of Stormont, how could they be used to deal with problems, emergencies like Lough Neagh?
Yeah.
And I think, it's all very well saying, the British and Irish governments need to step in, but we need to talk in specifics, like who is it within those structures that needs to step in and do something? Can councils do anything? I mean, we saw, you and I were at Belfast City Council and that was a motion about ownership.
Yes, so that was a motion that passed, actually. That was about exploring the possibility of public ownership and specifically a rights of nature approach. And that motion passed. So there's support for those at council level. Like, we know that. So I suppose it's just about harnessing, like you say, the mechanisms that are actually able to deliver action.
Yeah. I think that's critical now. I think we need to start talking in specifics about who exactly can do what. I mean, there's been talk about setting up a task force. There's been talk about, like in general terms, the government stepping in. But at this stage, that it needs to move beyond that. And we need to look at what can happen right now, and what can happen right now in the absence of a government. Because even if Stormont comes back in the near future, which, I mean, the jury's out on whether that's going to happen, but it's still going to be a long time before there's any sense of stable government here. So anything that is established now, especially cross-border, all-island structures or cooperative entities, they need to be able to weather the storms of an unstable government and unstable governance arrangements in the north. So I think the victims of that will be the environment. Like that's one of the areas that requires multiple levels of cooperation between departments. It's obviously a cross-cutting issue because you've got agriculture, environment, but you've also got economy, you've got infrastructure. These are all issues that require proper leadership. And at the minute, we just don't have it here.
Yeah. And I mean, like you say, the victim of that is the environment.
Yeah. And all the people in communities that depend on, Lough Neagh for their livelihood, and never mind its own intrinsic worth as a, part of nature, and I think that's something that it's hard to put a price on that, but that's something that increasingly the public are coming to be aware of, that is, there's a need to rethink our relationship with nature, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's probably, that's a good place maybe to end, to like finish up the conversation, is that it's about rethinking the way in which we relate to the world around us, and the kind of value that we place on it. Like, is it just economic value? Like, that's a really important question that we need to ask ourselves now about Lough Neagh. Is it just of economic value, or is it about much, much more than that? Sort of the cultural, environmental, it has such a rich, all these sort of layers of significance and meaning. And is the current owner, aware or tuned in to those layers of significance and meaning?
And really, what can the law do for us in this situation? I mean, we obviously have the environmental law, but property law is obviously something that can come into it. And I think maybe we need to explore how property law can play a role in achieving the outcomes that maybe environmental law hasn't done to date.
I mean, it's always a toolkit, isn't it? Sort of environmental governance. There's a range of different. So we're not saying we only look at ownership and property, or we only look at sort of more effective environmental regulation. We can see there's a range of different things that are all coming into play here. So action needed, I think, across all of those areas to
right now.
So thanks. I mean, thanks very much for listening to Ciara and I just have a bit of a chat about what needs to happen at Lough Neagh. And so hopefully we'll see some
we'll
kind
be
of
doing
action.
some more work on it over the next few months. And I think, there's a lot of organisations that have been doing great work, around the lough itself. There's community partnerships and trusts and also Friends of the Earth have been doing work on this for over a decade. So I think, there's many people are now looking at what can be done here. And I think it's now time to harness that, motivation and
for sure.
See what can happen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.